Hey, I'm Ryan from The Burnout Show, and in this video, I'm gonna show you how to replace your rear disc brakes on a 2017 Ford Escape. So a quick disclaimer before we get too deep into this, you are going to need a special tool for the brake caliper called a brake caliper rewind tool kit. Because this is not a traditional old-fashioned caliper that you can just squeeze in. It does require this special tool so that you can turn it back. So make sure you get one of these, borrow one from a friend, go buy one in a cheap store, whatever it is. You're just gonna need that in order to do this job. The first step is gonna be removing the tire. So you're just gonna need to remove the lug nuts using either a lug wrench or a impact if you have it. I have an impact and I already loosened all these, so I'm just gonna pull them off. You just wanna be careful where you put the nuts down because you wanna make sure you don't lose them because they are very easy to lose. So when we're going to replace our rear disc brakes, we're gonna be replacing the rotor and the brake pads themselves. So there's gonna be a few steps involved in this. The first one is going to be removing the brake caliper off of the setup. To do that, there's going to be a couple of rubber pieces hanging off the back. On the ends of the rubber pieces, there's a couple of caps. You can just pry those off with your fingers, or if they're a little bit stuck, you can get a screwdriver to pull that off. So once you get those plastic caps off, there's actually going to be an Allen key inside these rubber pieces. You're going to need an Allen wrench or an Allen socket in order to loosen those to get the caliper off. After you loosen those two bolts all the way, you're gonna wanna get a screwdriver or a small pry bar so that you can pry those bolts out so that they're far enough away from the bracket that they bolt into. Next, after that, there's going to be a little spring clip that goes on the outer edge of the caliper. You're gonna wanna pull that off as well using your pry bar or screwdriver, and you can just kind of pop that off. From here, the caliper itself should be ready to come off. You just might have to wiggle that a little bit as you pull it off. And there you go. You can just put that to the side a little bit. You want to be careful that that doesn't fall off and break anything. Now from here, there's going to be two 15mm bolts on the back of the rotor. These are holding in the caliper bracket right here, and we're going to need to remove those so we can get the caliper bracket off in order to replace the rotor. So these bolts are probably going to be a pain in the ass. They should be pretty tight on there. So you're either gonna need a long ratchet to get a lot of leverage, or the double wrench trick, or an impact. But I always like to break them loose using a wrench, so that's what I'm gonna do here. Oh. You can see that took a lot of leverage there. That one's broken loose. And so now that second one is broken loose as well. So I actually didn't have enough room to squeeze my impact in here, so I've just got a ratchet now. And I'm gonna pull these bolts off. All right, so like I said, these were in fact a pain in the ass. We did have to spray them up with a ton of WD-40 and then leave them for a few minutes, come back. But we did get them out, the two bolts. So now the caliper bracket just pops off. We can put that to the side. So our rotor's pretty stuck on there. So in this case, we're gonna grab a hammer, and the worst hammer you can possibly find. And we're just gonna hit it all around the rotor until it loosens. There we go. Now it's off. So now we got the old rotor off. You can see it's pretty rusty and pretty grooved. Toss that aside. So now we can grab our new rotor. And when you grab the new rotor, if it looks like this and it's not covered in a coat of paint, then we're gonna wanna get some brake clean and we're gonna wanna spray it off. We're gonna spray off the whole rotor.
That's crazy, I've never done that.
Because they come coated in oil so they don't rust in the packaging. But then you also have an oil slick on your car, on your brakes. So now we can just slap on the new rotor, just put it back over the 5 studs. So now we can take the caliper bracket and put this back on. You just want to slide it over the rotor and line it back up with the holes on the back, where we can now take the bolts and put it through. So you can start threading in the bolts by hand, and then I'm gonna grab my ratchet to thread those in tighter. Another good trick I like to do is actually to thread on one of the lug nuts all the way so that it holds down the rotor in place. So now the rotor is exactly where it's supposed to be and it's not gonna move. So now that we've got the caliper bracket back installed on the rotor, now we're gonna need to compress the caliper piston. The reason we gotta do that is so that we can put the pads in the caliper and that it has enough room to actually fit over the rotor. So like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this video, you are gonna need a special tool called a brake caliper rewind tool. And so this tool is gonna allow us to turn back the piston so that we can compress it and get the brake pads in. So the way this works is you're gonna need a few pieces. One is the thrust bolt. This car should use the left-hand thrust bolt, but your kit should also come with a right-hand thrust bolt. On top of that, in our kit, it's the piece labeled 7. It might be a different size on yours, it might be labeled differently. You just gotta make sure that you find the piece that have the notches that line up with the notches on the caliper piston. Then lastly, you're gonna need this plate so that you can put pressure on the front of the caliper so that you can twist the piston. The way this all goes together is you take the headpiece and you put it on top of the thrust bolt. It's got 2 pins that will line up, and ours has a magnet on it so that it stays on nice and good. And then we're gonna take the plate and slide that on the back all the way up to the front. Now we can take this assembly and put it inside the caliper. So when we go to put this in, like I said, we're gonna line up the 2 notches on top with the notches in the piston itself. From there, we're gonna loosen this nut so that it puts pressure up against that front wall on this plate. Now we're gonna be able to spin this so that it starts to loosen the piston on the caliper. And then once we get the piston loose enough, we're gonna be able to compress it all the way. And so as we do this, we're gonna need to continuously tighten this nut because as we turn, it's gonna loosen and then we're not gonna be able to actually turn the piston. So I've got that fully tight, so now it's pushing up against the back here. And so I can just turn the piston here. And now I'm gonna need to realign those pins and tighten that nut again. Now I can turn the piston and realign the pegs, tighten the nut. And you're just gonna need to do this a couple times until you can get it all the way loose. And so now I've got the, it loosened all the way so we can finish compressing this. You might need a wrench or a large pair of pliers in order to do that, but I've pretty much got that compressed all the way. So now I'm just gonna pull this off. Yeah, so you should be able to see right here that it's pretty flush with this outer edge of the caliper. And that's pretty much where you're gonna wanna get that so that you can get the pads in. The last thing is that you just wanna make sure that your 2 notches are vertical in the caliper. There's gonna be a pin on the brake pad that should line up with this notch on the caliper piston. So you just wanna make sure, like I said, that these are pretty much vertical so that you can line up those when you put on the pad. So the next step is gonna be greasing up the pads and the caliper. Typically when you're doing this, you wanna use a multi-purpose grease or a brake grease. Right now we just have white lithium grease on us and that should do the trick just fine. Basically, we're greasing this up to prevent squeaking when you're braking, because that can get really annoying for a lot of people, and we want to avoid that. So we're just gonna grease up a couple spots and I'll show you those spots. So the first spot is gonna be right on the caliper piston. The next spot is going to be on this back edge right here, where the outside pad rides. And then lastly, you wanna just hit these 2 little notches on the outside of the caliper. Just completely missed. Good. So So to install the pads, what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna place them directly onto the caliper bracket. This is gonna make it a lot easier to install the caliper if we go directly on here. So there's just gonna be 2 grooves on either end, and you just wanna slide those right onto the rotor, just like that. The only thing to note is that you wanna make sure you have the outside pad as the outside pad and the inside pad as the inside pad. The one with the spring on the top should go on the inside. From here, we can put the caliper back onto the rotor. The only thing that you wanna note here is that the caliper bolts are pushed back so that they don't interfere with trying to line up the caliper itself. So I'm gonna just go ahead, try to slap this down on there. So from here, we're just gonna wanna tighten the caliper bolts down. You just need to push those in and then use your Allen key from earlier to tighten them down. It might be a little bit tricky and you'll need a little bit of force pushing them in to do so, but just tighten those down all the way. All right, one of the last things that we're gonna need to do is put on the caliper retaining spring. I don't know exactly if that's the right term for this, but that's what I'm gonna call it. This can be a little tricky because it's gonna be really tight. But basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the 2 pegs and we're gonna stick them into the 2 holes, and then these larger flat parts gotta go under these large flat parts. And so it's gonna have a lot of tension on it. It's gonna be a little tough. You might need a screwdriver to help you pry it up, or a pair of pliers or something like that. But I'm just gonna kinda do this. I like to start by putting one all the way in, and then this kinda just slides right under. Then you're gonna pull this back, and now I'm gonna put this bottom part in, or under first. This is where I'll get a screwdriver to then pry this up into the hole. And then we just wanna make sure that that's all firmly seated in its place so it doesn't bounce out. You want this all to be firmly in the spots. Like you can see that this is pretty flush along there. It's not sticking out. That's how you want it. And from here, we'll put the plastic caps back in. These plastic caps are the ones that cover the Allen key. So they go right back here on the slides and should be pretty easy. Just kind of push those into the end of the rubber pieces. And once those bolts are tightened, you're all set to go. You're just gonna need to slap the tire back on. And then one thing to note before you start driving, you're gonna need to pump your brake pedal a little bit. Since we did compress the caliper, you're just gonna need to pump the brakes so that the car can push it back out so that you actually get some friction on your brakes. So that's gonna do it for this video. If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit the like button. Definitely subscribe for more great tutorials like this. If you have any other specific repairs that you want to see us do, make sure you leave those down in the comments below. And while you're down there, also check out our memberships. There's going to be a blue join button right next to the subscribe button, and you can click on that to learn all about the different benefits that you can get at the different levels. There's a lot of really cool, really fun stuff for you guys in there, so make sure you check that out. But that's going to do it for this video, so thank you for watching, and I hope this helped.